Hello, Guild friends and guest artists. If I haven't had the honor of meeting you yet, my name is Amy Lee, and I am one of the co-directors of the Anselm Arts Guild. I so wish I could be there with all of you today, and I miss you very much, but I know that you're in very good hands. And I'd like to thank Terry Moon and the Anselm Events team for pulling this retreat together so beautifully, and for giving me an opportunity to be a part of it, and for working so hard just to give some of us a time and a place to gather. I'd like to start off this session by reading a passage from one of my favorite books, The Lord of the Rings, and it's one that you've probably heard before, but here it is. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. This passage reminds me a little bit of a verse that goes with our theme for today of lights shining in darkness. And the verse is from Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 to 16, where Paul is exhorting the believers to do everything without complaining and arguing, and to live pure and blameless lives, so that as children of God in a depraved and twisted generation, they might be like stars shining in the universe as they hold out the word of life. And I think that's a particularly apt word for us today, as we as artists are trying to live lives that honor God and also to hold out the word of life. But it's also a challenging one, because how do we go on shining well when things seem increasingly dark and more foreboding and more muddled by the day? I'd like to make a brief persuasive argument for the goodness of having artists together in community, particularly for any of you who might feel on the fence about joining a community, or if you are already in a community and don't know what you could do to be more involved or to help build up that community. And I'd like to show you a little glimpse of what it's like when artists come together, because it is in a way like grouping stars, like constellations. Almost 5 years ago, I stumbled upon this particular community, and I wasn't looking for a writers group or an artist group in particular at that point. I was just elated to find a group of people who loved Lewis and Tolkien and things that I was drawn to but couldn't explain really why. And if I had been looking for a writers group around that time, I think I would have gone and searched for an established group of reputable writers and editors and looked on it kind of as a vehicle or an avenue for networking and for resources to help me make my writing better. What I actually found was something that included those things, but was actually much more. And all of that has included surprises and astonishing things that have come to light over the years. And if I recall correctly, when I first joined the Guild 5 or so years ago, it was just kind of getting off the ground then. And it started with careful introductions and discussions. I remember there was a lot of amiable nodding in those days when people were brave enough to share their work. And then as the faces became more familiar and more members started to come regularly to the meetings, the scope of our topics and the things that we shared began to widen and to deepen. If you were to walk into an Anselm Monthly Guild meeting from this past year, you would find skills being sharpened. You would find people writing epic poetry and creating science fiction novels and fantasy stories, sestinas and sgraffito pottery and liturgies and Lichtenberg wood burnings, and even things like instrumental melodies based on birdsong. You would find creative and contagious inspiration as people take sparks and ideas away from these things as they decide on their next work in progress. And that's because this guild is not a collective nudge towards finding a satisfying hobby. It's not a place where people are coming together to give each other permission to go and play for a little while, as a parent would say to a child. through the very existence of this community, we're acknowledging that the creation of art, although it is full of good play at times, is also a sober thing and a work well worthy of the effort. And as we come together and we gather and we resonate and examine things together, there's a silent sharing of permission to dive in and to be foolish in the eyes of the world, to invest time and energy in long-term projects that you don't know the end reception of. Additionally, if you were to walk into one of our meetings, you would find members asking each other about process. I actually have notes from a meeting long ago where we had quite an extensive conversation on process, and the artists were asking each other about the merits of combining different art forms, about the effect of combining an illustration with a story, and how you can have two tracks of influence upon the viewer and the reader at the same time. We talked about where the eye and the attention would go if a certain painting was cropped. We talked about the benefits of outlining or not outlining for artists, and we also talked about the detriment of creating art that is edgy just for the sake of being edgy. It was a very rich evening, and these deep conversations typically extend to the discussions of individual works of art as well. I can think of a couple examples for me that were very beneficial to me in deciding what direction to take a work in. And one of them was a few years ago, a member artist asked if I really wanted to have the image of Cerberus, which I had used as a comparison and an image building phrase in my essay, which was about the foretaste of heaven. And I bandersnatched, pushed back on the spot, and I said, well, yeah, I don't think I mind. Elysium is as much a part of Hades as Tartarus was, wasn't it? And I said something like that and was probably vastly pleased with myself. But I got home and it stuck in my consciousness, I think, for the next week or so. And in the end, I ended up excising that phrase from the text, and I liked it much better that way. And I'm not sure if I ever went back and I told the artist that I had ended up doing that. But I'm very grateful for his input because it made me think about the cohesiveness and the tiny details that I probably would have just glossed over in bringing it to completion. Another example for me is when a writer whose opinion I respect listened to a piece that I shared with the Guild and said that for him there was too much theology, there was too much overt scriptural reference in that particular essay. And I was so grateful that he had said that, because it made me stop and think, if I had to decide to err on a certain side, on the side of mentioning too much Bible or theology and mentioning too little, well, I'd really rather come down on the side of mentioning too much and having the reader feel like I had been too blunt rather than being vague. And that has to do with my background and the non-believers in my family, actually, because I would rather have that in there than not. But I was grateful for that feedback as well. And these are the kinds of conversations that happen in the Guild all the time, that we bring these things to each other's attention, and it forces you to think about not just that particular detail, but maybe the trajectory of the work or the overall effect that it might have on different people in your audience. And so all of this has been helpful, but not just these things. Of all of the things that have astonished me about the benefits of being part of a community, probably the best things have been the non-art related ones. When a group of people gets together for an extended period of time, the sharing of struggles begins to come to the surface. And it might be that one person one day is brave enough to talk about a struggle with depression or fear. It might be that someone talks about the difficulties of bringing a certain painting or sculpture into being and shares that. And from the meeting that I mentioned before, we talked about the challenges of working on a 2-year-old song that night. We talked about chipping away at the negative space around a Celtic knot. We mourned the rejection of a novel that had been rejected because of an overzealous climate of racial sensitivity. And we talked about the critical voice that says within all of us, well, but what is all of this for? What is the function of what you're doing, and is it of any use at all? But that particular meeting that I remember, that was so rich in conversation and so full of vulnerability, It began actually with the news that one of our members had been diagnosed with an advanced stage of lung cancer. And what I wrote at the close of my notes on that meeting was that it was peculiarly sweet that night, as if we were conscious that the conversation and collaboration and community were taking place under a very real umbrella of limited years that we are wise to count. Something that comes to mind from C.S. Lewis is actually what happened in the wake of one of the Inklings' deaths. When Charles Williams died, C.S. Lewis writes later in The Four Loves Under Friendship that when they lost Charles Williams, it wasn't Charles Williams merely that they lost. They lost the aspect of Tolkien that only Williams had been able to bring out. They lost the part of Lewis that Williams had been able to bring out. Because when you come together in a community, as an individual, you are able to call out of each person some aspect that another person wouldn't be able to call out of them. So the way that Tolkien would have responded to one of Williams's jokes, that was no longer there, and the opportunity to see that was no longer there once Williams had passed away. And I know that many of us are experiencing that in the Guild right now, in the wake of Chris Jager's passing a couple of weeks ago. And that doesn't mean that it isn't worth it to open our hearts and to be vulnerable, I believe. It means that there is a vast potential in the richness of community to draw out aspects of ourselves that we weren't aware of, to love. And taking that risk to love is what introduces nuance and compassion and connection to even the art that we're making and that we want to make. It's the soil from which everything else is going to grow, and this is the unseen work of community. It teaches us how to be humans living among other humans. Living among people whom you see on a regular basis, it helps you to see art in life and in suffering, and it makes one feel less floating and more grounded and more concrete. Ultimately, I think it helps us to see where our giftings fit into the needs of this generation and this world at present. And so this is the kind of thing that may happen in our constellations, in our groupings of people. The light begins to stand out, and each point seems more focused. But along the same line, this kind of connection and growth doesn't just happen in circles of artists. There are constellations, yes, but there's also something that I recently learned the existence of, which are called asterisms. And asterisms, in contrast to the more formal constellations, are popularly known, visually recognizable patterns of stars in the night sky, like the Big Dipper. And asterisms make me think of the thought development that has often had to happen for me to even begin working on a piece, thought development that I've had to talk through with somebody else. And often that somebody else has been my husband, or my friend in Oregon, or one of my girls. So one thing that I'm learning these days is how to go about strengthening those connections in times like these, in the middle of an isolating pandemic. It turns out that in a constellation or an asterism, none of the stars actually has to be very close together. And so things that I've been learning from other artists that I've been striving to pass on to yet other artists have been things like being willing to be a beta reader, going deep into reading somebody else's work, how to inquire gently about what somebody else is working on, and to tell them that their voice is missed if they've been quiet for a while. I'm full of admiration for those who seem to know supernaturally almost when to check in with somebody else, how to be there, how to lend a presence to somebody, how to give unstinting praise when some detail of a work has hit its mark. If I were to offer suggestions for how we can strengthen these connections in the middle of an isolating time, I think one of them would be to listen for another's vision. Imagine what it would be like for somebody else's work to come to its fullness. See it in its full potential so that you're able to sing that back to them as they give you kind of their aspirations and their hopes for the work. And that extends also to listening to others' input on your own work. I think Esty Smith in this year's Imagination Redeemed conference mentioned a quote by Frederick Buechner, which was that the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Your spouse may have as much insight into that as your mentor. And so paying attention to those informal connections that we have is just as important as the formal connections in keeping and building our communities. And I think one last very important aspect is to encourage people in the ways that come most naturally to us, whether that be in-person conversation or sending long letters or having in-depth conversations about a work in progress. These are all ways to exhibit and shine outward with love, even from far away. In this way, as we invest in each other's lives, we become the constellations and asterisms of light that band together to help others see the wonder of the great Creator's hand. And if this is what it's like when we have, to some extent, thorns in our sides and scales of mortality over our eyes, just imagine what it will be like when we have none of these things to hinder us and we are able to shout the glory of God to each other in a myriad ways over and over again. The book of Job says that when the cornerstone of the world was laid, the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy. And in the Psalms it says that he determines the number of stars and he gives to all of them their names. So because you are known, because the responsorial song of joy has been set within you, because you are named, shine like a star in this generation, friends, in the setting where you are. May you burn brightly and steadfastly, and all the more as you keep company with other individual lights. Through your own constellations and asterisms, may you show the overarching purposes, order, and beauty of God in a dimmed and darkening